Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In today's class, I'd like to provide a definition of various crimes according to the sections of criminal interest. Over the progress of review, I'll illustrate a typical case involving a homicide for the brief of facts and court holdings. In the context of U.S. criminal laws, the offenses could be classed in major 5 sections. The visual aids show this major classification. Let's see, first, offenses against the person, and offenses against the property, and sex offenses, and offenses against habitation and offenses involving a judicial procedure. For the offenses against person, we can illustrate assault and battery, mayhem, homicide, forced imprisonment, and kidnapping. Let's see, assault and battery. Battery is an unlawful application of force to the person of another, resulting in either bodily injury or an offensive touching. Simple battery is a misdemeanor. A battery did not be intentional, and the force did not be applied directly. For example, causing a dog to attack the victim is a battery. Some jurisdictions recognize consent as a defense to simple battery or certain specified batteries. Most jurisdictions treat the following as aggravated batteries and punish them as felonies: battery with a deadly weapon, battery resulting in serious bodily harm, and battery of child, woman, or police officer. Assault is either an attempt to commit a battery or the intentional creation, other than by mere words, of a reasonable apprehension in the mind of a victim of imminent bodily harm. If there has been actual touching of the victim, the crime can only be battery, not assault. Aggravated assault is treated more severely than simple assault. Think of assault as 2 separate crimes: attempted battery assault, a specific intent crime, and creation of a reasonable apprehension assault. Be sure to consider both types of assault in answering a question, because one may apply even though the other does not. For example, if the defendant stops a V at a knife point and demands a V's money, but was merely trying to scare V by posing as a robber and feigning hold-up, they have committed creation of reasonable apprehension assault, but not attempted battery assault. You now want to decide that they is not guilty of assault because you saw only about attempted battery assault. A common law, the felony of mayhem requires either dismemberment or disablement of a body part. The recent trend is to abolish mayhem as a separate offense and treat it instead as a form of aggravated battery. And we turn to see a homicide crime. A common law, criminal homicide is divided into 3 categories. The fourth category is murder. Murder is the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. Malice aforethought exists if there are no facts reducing the killing to voluntary manslaughter or excusing it, and if it was committed with one of the following states of mind. To say intent to kill, intent to inflict a great bodily injury, and reckless indifference to an unjustifiably high risk to human life, and intent to commit a felony. Intentional use of a deadly weapon authorizes a permissive inference of intent to kill. Homicides are emotionally charged crime, so you must be careful not to let your emotions lead you to an incorrect answer. If a defendant killed with one of the states of mind above, he is guilty of murder. If he did not, he is not guilty of murder. Thus, even where the facts go out of their way to paint the defendant as a completely despicable human being, you cannot convict him of murder when he drives into a schoolyard, killing 3 children, if the incident was due to a defendant's fiddling with a cigarette lighter. More troublesome is the mercy killing case. If defendant intends to kill, even as an act of love, he is guilty of murder. Society does not accept compassion as a sufficient justification for the killing of a human being. So I read the exam tip for your preparation in about the final exam. And voluntary manslaughter is killing that would be murder for the existence of adequate provocation. Provocation is adequate only if it was a provocation that would arouse sudden and intense passion in the mind of an ordinary person, causing him to lose self-control. And the defendant was in fact provoked to satisfy this crime, the element of this crime. There was not sufficient time between a provocation and killing for passion of a reasonable person to cool. And lastly, the defendant in fact did not cool off between the provocation and the killing. The adequacy of provocation is a key issue in homicide questions. Be sure to consider carefully the 4 factors for adequate provocation, and not just jump to the conclusion that there was adequate provocation because you see some signs of provocation in the fact pattern. Also know the interplay between the reasonable person standard and what actually happened to defendant. Later in this class, we would pick up a case dealing with this kind of a context. Consider a sudden and intense passion that causes a reasonable person to lose control. A passion must be reasonable under the circumstances. Defendant cannot have been set off by something that will not bother most others. It is required the defendant lost control. Even if a reasonable person would have been provoked, if defendant was not, there is no reduction to manslaughter. And there must be not enough time for reasonable person to cool off. This is tricky because it is hard to say how much time is needed to cool off. A lot depends on the situation, but the more time that has passed, the more likely it is that the original person would have cooled off. And defendant did not cool off. It is a prerequisite to find this a crime. This is a little easier to judge. If the facts show the defendant claimed down, there is no reduction to manslaughter. And some states recognize an imperfect self-defense doctrine under which murder may be reduced to manslaughter even though the defendant was at fault in starting the altercation, or the defendant unreasonably and honestly believed in the necessity of responding with deadly force. In that case, defendant's actions do not qualify for self-defense. And we have another type of a homicide named involuntary manslaughter. The killing is involuntary manslaughter if it was committed with criminal negligence or during the commission of an unlawful act. In some jurisdictions, murder is divided into degrees by statute. A murder will be second-degree murder unless it comes under the following circumstances, which would make it a fourth-degree murder. If the defendant made a decision to kill in a cool and dispassionate manner and actually reflected on the idea of killing, even if only for a brief period, it is a fourth-degree murder. Fourth-degree murder based on premeditation requires a specific intent, which may be negated by the defense of a voluntary intoxication. If the defendant was so intoxicated that he was unable to premeditate, he can be convicted only of a second-degree or common law murder, which requires only reckless indifference to human life. If a murder is committed during the perpetration of an enumerated felony, it is a fourth-degree murder. The felonies most commonly listed include arson, robbery, burglary, rape, maim, and kidnapping. In these jurisdictions, other felony murders are second-degree murder. Some statutes make killings performed in certain ways. For example, by tort, a fourth-degree murder. Any death caused in the commission of or in an attempt to commit a felony is murder. Malice is implied from the intent to commit the underlying felony. The common law, there are only a handful of felonies. To say burglary, arson, rape, and sodomy, and so forth. Statutes today have created many more felonies, but the felony murder doctrine is limited to felonies that are inherently dangerous. But there are several limitations on this rule. First, the defendant must be guilty of the underlying felony. And second, the felony must be distinct from the killing itself. To say, commission of aggravated battery that causes the victim's death does not qualify as an underlying felony for felony murder liability. Third, death must have been a foreseeable result of the felony. A minority of cause require only that the felony be malum in se. And fourth, the death must have been caused before the defendant's immediate fright from the felony ended, Once the felon has reached a place of a temporary safety, subsequent deaths are not felony murder. In most jurisdictions, the defendant is not responsible for the deaths of a co-felon caused by resistance from the felony victim or the police, although the defendant may be responsible for similar deaths of third parties. And please note similar limitations on misdemeanor manslaughter. Generally, the misdemeanor must be a maluming se, or if the misdemeanor involved is not maluming se, the death must have been a foreseeable result of the commission of the misdemeanor. And you can see in the visual aid the fourth, a causation, title causation. The defendant's conduct must be both the causing fact and the proximate cause of the victim's death. The defendant's conduct is causing fact of the result if the result would not have occurred before the defendant's conduct. Therefore, the buffer test normally applies to find a causing fact, and that is also the case in civil law, a tort law. The defendant's conduct is the proximate cause of the result if the result is a natural and probable consequence of the conduct, even if the defendant did not anticipate the precise manner in which the result occurred. Superseding factors break the chain of proximate causation. And we also will further on this issue by illustration of some of a representative cases later in the class. On act, the pattern and inevitable result is still the legal cause of the result. Also, simultaneous acts of two or more persons may be independently sufficient causes of a single result. A victim's existing weaknesses or fragility, even if unforeseeable, does not break the chain of causation. There are two limitations on the rule of causation. We can find a yen and a day rule in this context. For the defendant to be liable for homicide, the death of the victim must occur within 1 year and 1 day from infliction of the injury or wound. I'm not sure why this kind of rule originated, but it is occasional to see this kind of delicate dealings. But particularly, you may find some of cases in real property law. Generally, an intervening act shields the defendant from liability if the act is a coincidence or is outside the foreseeable sphere of risk created by the defendant. Please note that a third party's negligent medical care and the victim's refusal of medical treatment for religious reasons are both foreseeable risks, so the defendant would be liable. Forced imprisonment consists of the unlawful confinement of a person without its valid consent. It is not confinement to simply prevent a person from going where she desires to go, as long as alternative routes are available to her. Please note also that consent is invalidated by coercion, stress, deception, or incapacity due to mental illness, retardation, or use. Modern statutes often define kidnapping as unlawful confinement of a person that involves either some movement of the victim or a concealment of the victim in a secret place. Aggravated kidnapping includes kidnapping for ransom, kidnapping for the purpose of committing other crimes, kidnapping for offensive purposes, and child stealing. In the case of child stealing, the consent of a child to her detention or movement is not of importance because the child is incapable of giving a valid consent. One of the important concepts in the discourse of homicide should be heat of passion, about which we now take a little journey to understanding. A killing, though otherwise be murder, but that was committed in response to adequate provocation, is committed without malice of thought and is therefore a voluntary manslaughter. Generally, the provocation must be such as might render ordinary persons of average disposition liable to act rashly without deliberation and from passion rather than judgment. There would be several elements to bring about the adequate provocation. There must have been provocation of the kind that would cause a reasonable person to lose control and act rashly and without reflection. And there must be an actual provocation. The defendant must have in fact been provoked, and the provocation must have caused the defendant to kill the victim. And there must be an absence of reasonable cooling period. The interval between the provocation and the killing must not have been long enough for the passions of a reasonable person to cool. And the defendant must, on mental state of no actual cooling off at the time of committing the homicide. The defendant must not have actually cooled off during the interval between the provocation and the killing. The case titled Morani versus Wilver addressed the problem about allocation of burden of proof from the grounds of due process requirement. In this case, the court found that the main requirement, the main is the state of the United States, one of state of the United States. Main requirement constitutes a denial of due process, that the defendant proved he acted in the heat of passion on certain provocation. We are available about a brief fact pattern. Let's see, a petition for certiorari by the prosecution due to district and appellate courts allowing habeas corpus relief. And Wilver, this is the defendant's name. Wilver fatally assaulted Herbert after Herbert's homosexual advance. The defense argued that the homicide was not unlawful since they lacked criminal intent, or alternatively that at most the homicide was manslaughter rather than murder, since it occurred in the heat of passion provoked by the homosexual assault. The state of Maine, where the homicide occurred, requires that the defendant charged in the murder prove he acted in the heat of passion on certain provocation in order to show lack of malice of assault, and thus reduce the homicide from murder to manslaughter. The defendant was convicted of murder and appealed to the Maine Supreme Court, which rejected a defendant's contentions. Defendant then filed a writ of habeas corpus with the Federal District Court on the basis that the main rule violates due process because the prosecution is not required to prove beyond a reasonable doubt every fact necessary to constitute the crime charged, but is permitted to rely on implied malice aforethought if the defendant fails to prove he acted in the heat of passion on certain provocation. The Court of Appeals affirmed the District Court's ruling in favor of a defendant, and the United States Supreme Court granted certiorari. It is normally accepted that the elements of crime must be proven by a prosecution. In this main state, in this main statute, we find that some of the elements, the proof of, burden of proof about some of the elements, it was imposed on the defendant. Is it constitutionally permissible? The court said no. Here, the state argued that there was no denial of due process, since homicide and the presence or absence of heat of passion on certain provocation pertained merely to the punishment. However, a state could undermine a defendant's right to due process by eliminating the requirement that the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt the elements of the crime, by instead redefining these elements and characterizing them simply as factors that bear solely on the extent of punishment. So in the core opinion, requiring the defendant to prove the critical fact in a dispute increased the likelihood of an erroneous conviction. The prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt the absence of the heat of passion on certain provocation when the issue is properly presented in a homicide case. In Patterson versus New York, decided in 1977, the Supreme Court held that an affirmative defense to charge a murder provided by New York law was a considerably expanded version of the common law defense of heat of passion on a sudden provocation, and that the burden of proving such an affirmative defense could be placed on the defendant without constituting a denial of due process. A dissenting opinion, however, argued that Patterson really was indistinguishable from Mallory. So we have separate rules in this area of law between a Patterson versus a Patterson and a Mullaney. The majority distinguished a Patterson from Mullaney, but the dissenting opinion would consider it as same. And whether the provocation was reasonable under the circumstances is traditionally judged by an objective standard. To say it is not enough that the defendant was provoked if a reasonable person would not have been. Then what are the characteristics of the reasonable person? In applying the requirement of provocation to inflame a reasonable person, courts have struggled with the extent to which the reasonable person should be attributed with the defendant's peculiar characteristic that may have made him unusually susceptible to provocation. In People versus Washington, decided in 1976, the court conform the rule of reasonable person standard in measuring the heat of passion. Therefore, the court found that the ordinary reasonable person standard is the standard by which heat of passion has to be measured. In this case, appeal from second-degree murder conviction was made. A Washington shot and killed his homosexual partner, O.M. Brady. The killing resulted from a lover's quarrel, claimed to have been provoked by Brady's unfaithfulness and expressed desire to terminate the relationship. He was convicted of second-degree murder and appeal. The court stated that the jury must find that a defendant acted in heat of passion to reduce murder to manslaughter. Heat of passion is tested by the ordinary reasonable person standard. Defendant contends that it was prejudicial to apply this standard. He argued that either standard applicable to female or a standard applicable to the average homosexual should be applied. What do you think about in this point of consideration? What standard would be proper to give you a fair administration of justice? And the court furthered, no defendant may set up his own standard of conduct and justify or excuse himself because in fact his passions were aroused. The reasonable person of ordinary self-control is the applicable standard. Let's obtain some of a model penal code position. The model penal code provides that the reasonableness of the disturbance which reduces the killing to manslaughter is to be determined from the viewpoint of a person in the defendant's position under the circumstances as the defendant believed them to be. This allows the court to take into account some of the defendant's special characteristics, but it is not clear where the line is to be drawn. So it is very a delicate area of a consideration that the juror has to be scrupulous to get through the involved circumstances. We now consider several situations that could possibly be viewed to be an adequate provocation. How about a words alone? The traditional and majority view has been that mere words, no matter how insulting, are not adequate provocation. When it comes with a battery situation, a minor blow, even if technically a battery, does not constitute adequate provocation on the theory that it would not provoke a reasonable person to killing passion. But a violent and painful blow can be sufficient provocation, whether administered with hand or a weapon. In the case of assault, we may be split as to whether an unsuccessful attempt to commit a battery can constitute a provocation. The better view, however, is that it may, especially in aggravated cases. The person may encounter an illegal arrest. How about that? Similarly, courts have differed as to whether the victim's unlawful arrest of the defendant can constitute adequate provocation. Probably the best view is that it can, particularly where the defendant was aware of the unlawful nature of the arrest. And we may be a little more frequent with the situation of adultery. It is well established that discovery of one's spouse in the act of committing adultery is sufficient provocation. Moreover, the modern trend is to extend this rule beyond situations where one spouse actually catches the other in the act. Thus, some courts find a sufficient provocation where the defendant is told of his or spouse's adultery. And also, we can usually see a mutual quarrel or combat. How about that? If two persons voluntarily engage in a fight in the course of which one is killed, the homicide is only manslaughter. Conceptually, the suddenness of the affray, rather than any specific action by the victim, is a provocation. The heat of passion may be brought in the context of an accumulation. So in the case of People versus Berry, decided in 1976, the court sustained that the heat of passion may be aroused over a period of time through a series of events. In this case, appeal from conviction for first-degree murder was made. Berry, who was defendant in the case, choked his wife into unconsciousness. At the hospital, she told the police of the strangulation. A few days later, they telephoned a friend and told her he had strangled his wife with a telephone call. The police gained entry to the couple's apartment and found the wife's body. The defendant confessed to the murder. At trial, the defendant did not deny the murder, but said he was provoked into killing her because of a sudden and uncontrollable rage, so as to reduce the offense to voluntary manslaughter. Defendant alleged that his wife was in love with another man and that she tormented a defendant by taunting him with a sexual involvement with Yako. A psychiatrist testified that defendant's wife was a depressed, suicidally inclined woman who deliberately provoked defendant into rages. The night before the murder, defendant had been alone in his and his wife's apartment. Defendant was convicted of first-degree murder and now appealed. The court gave the opinion. It is left to jurors to decide whether the facts create a reasonable doubt in their minds that an accused committed the offense in the heat of passion. This heat of passion must be such a passion as will naturally be aroused in the mind of an ordinary reasonable person under the given facts. No defendant may set up his own standard for the heat of passion. The court further, a passion does not mean rage or anger, but may be any violent, intense, high-rolled, or enthusiastic emotion, and may be aroused over a period of time by a series of events. Here, the facts are such that an ordinary reasonable man could have been provoked into rage. The Attorney General's contention that because of a cooling off period, the murder could not be under the heat of passion is rejected. Evidence showed that this passion was the result of a long series of provocative events. A crime committed under heat of passion lacks the malice element required under a first-degree murder statute. We now need to grasp the essence on the degrees of murder. At common law, there are no degrees of murder. Statutes, however, often divide murder into first and second degree. The offense of first-degree murder has no common law equivalent. It is entirely a creature of statute. While generalization is somewhat difficult, statutes typically classify the following homicides as first-degree murder. There are two classes involving premeditated killings and killing during enumerated felonies. Let's get a more detail about this problem. Premeditated killings are those in which the intent to kill is formed pursuant to pre-existing reflection rather than a sudden impulse or heat of passion. While there is general agreement on abstract definition of a premeditation, courts disagree on the extent to which the evidence must demonstrate an opportunity for rather extended reflection. In this case, there will be no need to establish a no appreciable time element. A number of courts do not weigh premeditation in units of time. They do not require showing that there was an appreciable period of time during which the defendant could have weighed the pros and cons of killing. Rather, the formulation of the intent to kill and the act upon his intent can occur as instantaneously as successive thoughts. Others, however, insist upon proof that the defendant did give the matter reasonably calm consideration. Additionally, a killing committed during the perpetration of certain statutory enumerated felonies is often made first-degree murder. The specified felonies typically include arson, rape, robbery, burglary, kidnapping, maim, and sexual molestation of child, as I have illustrated in the first of this class. Please note that not all felony murders will be murder in the first degree. If the killing arises out of felony, which is not enumerated in the applicable statute, and does not otherwise qualify for first-degree murder, it is second-degree murder. So, now it is clear to define a second-degree murder. In the statutes that divide the murder into degrees, all killings committed with malice aforethought, which are not specifically made a first-degree murder, are considered a second-degree murder. And the case titled United States v. Browns, decided in 1975, dealt with the proof issue of a premeditation. In this case, the court held premeditation may be established by the jury's adducing it from the facts and circumstances surrounding his killing. Appeal from a first-degree murder conviction was made in this case. Brown was defendant in this case, a prison inmate whose cell was searched, asked who the snitch was and said, "If I find him, I send him to you in a pine box." Later that day, the victim spilled some water and went to the mop room to get a mop to clean it up. In front of witnesses, defendant stabbed Atkins 21 times over the space of at least 2 minutes. Some of the stabbing took place after the victim had crawled from the mop room to the corridor. While being led away, defendant was heard to say, "I just got rid of a punk who's been bothering me." They were tried and convicted of fourth-degree murder. The defendant appealed, claiming that there was insufficient evidence of premeditation to sustain the conviction. In this case, the court disposed in this way. See, we have a gist of a court opinions on the printer. No particular time period is required for deliberation or premeditation. Even minutes are enough time. A defendant, premeditation can be adduced from the facts and circumstances. Here, the victim was stabbed over 21 times. Violent killings strongly tend to prove that the killing was malicious. The stabbing in the corridor certainly came after they had time to reflect upon what he was doing. Further, what defendant said before and after the killing could reasonably lead the jury to believe the defendant acted with premeditation. For all of these reasons, the conviction is affirmed. In the case titled People v. Anderson, decided in 1968, the court found a brutality alone to be insufficient as a premeditation. The court found the brutal nature of killing by itself may not provide inferences sufficient to support a finding of a fourth-degree murder. Let's see the fact pattern of this case. Anderson, who was a defendant, lived with a woman who had 3 children, including Victoria, who was 10 years old. They stayed home from work for 2 days, drinking heavily. On the 3rd day, his girlfriend left for work, leaving a defendant home with Victoria, who later went to school. Early that afternoon, defendant bought whiskey at a nearby liquor store. Victoria came home around 4:45 p.m. Her brother Kenneth came home about 4:30, found the doors locked, and went into the basement for a while. He heard noises upstairs and entered the house by shaking pans and saw blood on the kitchen floor. Entered the house by shaking the back door latch open. He saw defendant dressed only in pants and saw blood on the kitchen floor. Defendant explained that he had cut himself. Kenneth later found Victoria's nude, bloody in a room on the floor near her bed. The police found Victoria's torn clothes and blood throughout the house. Victoria's dress had been torn from her, and the crotch of her panties had been ripped out. Her body had over 60 cut wounds, including one cut from the rectum through the vagina. No spermatozoa was found. The only clothes of this that were bloody were his shocks and shows. It is really a zone of danger that no normal person could be shocked. A trial, the prosecution claimed that the murder was sexually motivated and argued that it was first-degree murder because it was premeditated, or alternatively because it was committed in the perpetration of a lewd and lascivious act upon the body of a child under age 14. Defendant was convicted of first-degree murder and appeals. In this case, the court found the evidence sufficient to show premeditation and deliberation consists of three types. In the court opinion, the first type is the evidence that the accused planned the actual killing, and second, evidence about the accused's prior relationship with the victim, the supposed an inference or motive, and third, evidence that the manner of killing was so particular and exacting that the defendant must have intentionally killed. According to the court opinion, if all three are not present, there must be strong evidence of the first element or evidence of second, together with either first or third. In cases where the accused acts surreptitiously stalks his victim or does other pre-killing planning activity differ from the present case, where there is a total absence of evidence of such planning. Evidence of a vicious blood attack in the absence of type 1 or second. Evidence permits only an inference that the killing resulted from a random, violent, indiscriminate attack, not an inference that the accused acted with a premeditation. Thus, the evidence here supposes only a second-degree murder. And the evidence that showed that the defendant tore Victoria's clothes off while dressed only in his socks and shorts and cased her around the house. This is insufficient proof that he was performing lewd and lascivious acts, however. For involuntary manslaughter, the case titled Heim versus Director of Public Prosecution, decided in 1974, confirmed the rule that wantonness could negate mere negligence. So in the situation of wantonness, we may find a higher degree of a culpability. So let's see, the court in this case ruled that malice can be established by acts which a reasonable person would have foreseen as likely to cause serious bodily harm or death. This case involves a murder conviction. An appeal was made. Hyam, a defendant in this case, set fire to the home of Mrs. Booth by pouring gasoline into a mailbox and igniting it with a newspaper. 2 children died in the fire. They testified that she only wanted to frighten Booth into leaving town. She did not intend to injure anyone. Booth was to marry a man of whom defendant had been a mistress. And defendant was found guilty and appealed. We have an opinion from Lord Hersham, and another opinion from Lord A. Kilbrandon. This is a British case. And also we can find several opinions from Lord Diplock and Lord Cross and Dilholm, Viscount Dilholm. Viscount is an entitlement to be conferred on the noble class of Britain, and Lord is also the same. The appeal fails and should be dismissed. A malicious falsehood may be established by showing that the defendant knew his act would probably cause death or serious bodily harm. This is true even if the defendant did not wish to cause bodily harm. Killing with intent to do serious bodily harm is murder. The conviction should be affirmed and the appeal has to be dismissed according to the opinion from Viscount Dilholm. The law draws no distinction between the state of mind of one who does an act because he desires it to produce a particular evil consequence, and the state of mind of one who does the act knowing full well that it is likely to produce the consequence, although it may not be the object he sought to achieve by doing the act. The relevant intention on a murder charge should be an intention to kill or cause any bodily injury which is known to the offender to be likely to endanger life. Such intent is lacking here. I would allow the appeal and substitute a verdict of guilty or manslaughter for the murder verdict. And the court also opined doing an unlawful act with knowledge that it may well cause death is murder if the act does in fact result in death. Doing an unlawful act with knowledge that grievous bodily harm may well result is murder if the act does in fact result in death. And the court opinion we find we also find this rule. Since the death penalty no longer exists, there is no longer any reason why the crimes of murder and manslaughter should not be abolished, and the crime of unlawful homicide is substituted. Sentences would then vary from life downward according to the gravity of the offense. But as the law now stands, the judge erred in the summing up and the appeal should be allowed. As mentioned earlier, wanton conduct resulting in death is murder. It makes no difference that the killer did not intend to hurt anyone. Technically, it may be charged in voluntary manslaughter in the United States context. On the felony murder, you need to know that a number of states limit the rule to underlying felonies of a specific nature. In the case titled State versus Goosehill, we find two issues involved. The first issue is if a necessary element of felony murder is that the felony must be one inherently dangerous to human life. And the second issue would be if possession of firearm by a convicted felon is inherently dangerous to human life. In this case, Goosehill defendant had been released from prison after serving time for 2 rape convictions. They met a dancer named Silky who turned tricks. After work one night, Silky wanted Dee to pretend he was her husband and pull her out of the car so she would not have to actually have sexual relations with a man named Hunter. She had met at work that night. Silky gave a defendant a gun with which to scare Hunter. That night, they went to the car and tapped on the glass with a pistol's butt, pretending to be Silky's husband. Silky got out of the car and asked the defendant to get her shoes. Defendant alleged that he bent over to get the shoes. He slipped on the snow and bumped into the car door, and the gun discharged, killing Hunter. At the fourth trial, the defendant was convicted of unlawful possession of firearm and acquitted of aggravated assault. And the jury was deadlocked on a felony murder charge. And the jury was deadlocked upon a second trial. Upon a second trial, the defendant was convicted of murder in the 4th degree, down in the commission of felony. And the defendant appealed the murder conviction. The court responded affirmatively on both 2 questions. So the court stated, a felony must be one inherently or foreseeably dangerous to human life for the felony murder statute to apply. Such an inherently dangerous requirement maintains a logical basis for imputing a malice. The legislature has recognized that persons who had once committed a felony are dangerous to society and should not have concealable weapons in their possession. However, beyond this, where doubt may exist, both the nature of the offense in the abstract and when necessary for a determination, the circumstances of its commission are relevant factors in considering whether a particular felony was inherently and foreseeably dangerous to human life. In this case, defendant's possession of firearm was a sufficient basis for application of the felony murder rule. But Justice Prager dissented. The felony murder rule is an artificial concept and should not be extended beyond any rational function. Surely, it is no more inherently dangerous for a felon to illegally carry a concealed weapon than for a non-felon. Mere possession in itself is essentially neutral and does not serve as a basis for imputing malice. Under the foggy rule set forth by the majority, absurdities would result, according to the dissenting opinion. An example of considering the nature of the offense in the abstract is the following. A defendant stole a large sum of money by pickpocketing. One day, while picking a V's pocket, they stumbled on broken pavement, colliding with a V, who in turn fell through a plate glass window and died. There would appear to be, from examining the nature of the offense in the abstract, no inherent danger. In the former case, the dissent gave in support of its final point essentially the following argument. The previously convicted of felony for riding a bomb truck, buys a gun with which to protect himself and his family. One day, while guests are visiting, drafts the gun. It discharges and kills the guest. In the majority opinion, defendant would be guilty of first-degree murder. You might turn to be emotionally aggravated to hear the criminal cases. Sorry on that point. And as I've said, the causation is another essential requirement to establish a homicide charge. And ordinarily, a factual causation alone does not mean a criminal liability. So we may advance to a proximate causation and a kind of a superseding factors, which could be said to break the chain of causation. In the factual causation, the traditional but-for test has to be applied. In the case titled State versus Laws, the court confirmed for manslaughter conviction, a defendant's negligence must precede the death. Rose, defendant, while driving his car, struck the decedent. The decedent's body first was thrown up on the hood, then rolled off and was wedged under the car. Defendant drove the car several hundred feet, abandoned it, and set out to establish a false alibi. The prosecution did not put on any evidence the defendant was culpably negligent up to and including the time when they struck the decedent. Expert pathological testimony established that the decedent could have died at the time of the primary impact or later while being dragged under the car. He was convicted of manslaughter and appealed. The court held, under the facts in this case, you are unable to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that the decedent was alive after the primary impact, and thus the defendant's action was culpably negligent, leading to the death. In the full opinion, the court went on to hold that evidence supported this defendant's conviction for leaving the scene of an accident. This case also demonstrates the difference between factual causation and legal causation. For liability in this case, defendant's legal infraction, the negligence had to cause the death. Since there was no evidence of negligence prior to impact, the legal, in other words, a proximate cause of death had to be his fleeing after the impact. Since the court was not sure beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim died after the proved negligence, there could be no legal liability. The existence of factual causation will not alone support a finding of criminal liability, as I've said. In addition, there must be proof of proximate causation. Proximate causation problems arise primarily when an expected result occurs in a manner not contemplated by the defendant. And the issue is whether the difference between the anticipated sequence of events and what actually transpired is enough to break the chain of causation. So the proximate causation normally requires all natural and probable consequences. In other words, the defendant will not be relieved of liability simply because the harm which he intended was occasioned by an unanticipated sequence of events. And the problem of proximate causation would be normally troubled with a superseding factors in the kind of a practical situation. To constitute a supervening cause, the independent occurrence must meet several requirements. First of all, it must be an intervening factor set in motion after the defendant's act. Therefore, a pre-existing condition cannot be a superseding cause. The case titled Kibe versus Henderson dealt with the issue of a intervening a force. In this case, the court a jury must have given detailed instructions on the issue of causation, or if an intervening force is present in the facts. So the court said the omission of any definition of causation permitted the jury to conclude that the issue was not before them, or the causation could have been merely from the fact that Stafford's death succeeded his abandonment by D. The defendant was Kibe, and there is a co-dependent named Corral, and Stafford is a decedent, victims of this case. Even if the jury were aware of the causation issue, they did not receive sufficient instruction on this issue. The possibility that the jury, as laypersons, may misconstrue the evidence before them, it makes mandatory in every case instructions as to the applicable legal standards. The few cases with similar fact patterns suggest that the controlling causation cases in intervening cause cases is whether the ultimate result was foreseeable to the original actor, and whether the victim failed to do something easily within his reach that would have extricated him from danger. The New York appellate courts applied these standards and found sufficient evidence. We do not doubt the conclusion. However, it was the jury's function to make this determination. The appellate courts may not substitute their own findings for the jury's failure to consider the issue. Thus, the lack of jury instructions deprived defendant of due process. So the New York appellate court is a lower court in this case, and defendant appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the case involves a Harvey Coast relief. In this case, the relevant statute provided a person is guilty of murder in the second degree when, under circumstances evincing a depraved indifference to human life, he recklessly engages in conduct which creates a grave risk of death to another person and thereby causes the death of another person. So you need to know that it is a constitutional issue to deprive the right to jury trial. It is an essential aspect that should be considered in the context of a due process. And also, Blake was certainly an intervening force. In this case, the collision was made and Blake returned to help the dissident. And so it is raised as one of an intervening force. The issue, if the case had been properly tried, would have been the liability of defendant for the intervening force. The principal sub-issue under this rubric would have been the determination of whether the intervening force was a sufficiently independent or supervening cause of death. And one of the interesting cases to involve a victim's refusing to accept life-saving on religious grounds. It is sufficient to constitute a supervening factor for the death of victim. What do you think about that? In the case titled Regina versus Browse, the court found that kind of a incident did not break the chain of causation in homicide cases. In this case, a bro defendant entered Ude's house. Ude is decedent. Decedent was practicing Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witness. This kind of religious creed can also be found in Korea. When a defendant asked for sexual intercourse, decedent refused. Defendant responded by stabbing her for 4 times. Subsequently, decedent was taken to the hospital where she was told that a blood transfusion was necessary to save her life. On the ground of religious belief, she refused, signing a statement that she would refuse a blood transfusion under any circumstance. She died the next day. Defendant's diminished responsibility was not contested, nor was the fact that the decedent would not have died if she had had a transfusion. Defendant appealed, claiming that the decedent's action in refusing the transfusion broke the chain of causation. It is interesting to see 2 different consequences. One would be death because of the victim's religious belief. In other normal cases, the victim might get restored from the stabbed wounds. Then we have to see the accused to be unfortunate, or it is fair to judge him to be a murderer. Let's see. According to the court opinion, the common law provides that he who inflicts mortal injury could not excuse himself by pleading that the victim could have avoided death by taking great care of himself. Thus, if the original wound is still an operating cause and a substantial cause of death, the accused is still liable. The death does not flow from the wound only. If the second cause is so overwhelming as to make the original wound merely part of the history. Here, defendant counsel suggests that the jury should weigh the reasonableness of the decedent's decision to forego the life-saving transfusion. The question raised is reasonable by whose standards? A Catholic, Jehovah's Witnesses? The issue of reasonableness or religious belief could produce different results in a Catholic town and a Protestant town. The best policy is the communal policy, which say that those who use violence on another must make the victims as they find them. We take this to mean the victim as a whole person and not just as a physical person. While in a civil case, the victim has the duty to mitigate damages, such should not be the case in criminal trials. Since the goal of civil law is compensation, and the goal of criminal law is the maintenance of law and order and the protection of the public. Thus, the question of the cause of death is one of fact for the jury. In this case, there is no contradicting evidence, and thus the judge could have told the jury that the stab wound was the operative cause of death. The issue in this case called for the court to decide if it was the unreasonable acts of the victim that caused the death, or if the legal maxim, the criminal takes the victim as he finds him, applies. Take a victim as he found typically involves the physical attributes. For example, a criminal hits an unusually sin-skilled victim on the head, while robbing him, and death results. Any difference against normal victims? We find a critical difference, but does it matter with the accused? Here, the court recognized the doctrine's application to the whole person. And I have another case concerning a capital punishment titled Gregg versus Georgia. There would be several cases dealing with a death penalty in the United States, and it involves an analysis of Eighth Amendment in the United States Constitution. And the court now seems not to be definitive about the constitutionality of death penalty. It could be flexible from the involved circumstances. And I like to forego the kind of discussion for your other classes. And you may find other kind of crimes, including rape, a statutory rape, a crime against nature, adultery, a fornication, and some other crimes under the rubric of a property offenses, and so forth. Let's see a little further the sex offenses. What is rape? Rape is the unlawful carnal knowledge of a woman by man, not her husband, without her effective consent. The slightest penetration is sufficient. Under the traditional rule, a husband cannot rape his wife, but most states today either reject this rule entirely or rejected where the parties are estranged or separated. There would be some change in this area of law in the jurisdiction of Korea also. To be rape, the intercourse must be without effective consent. Lack of effective consent exists where intercourse is accomplished by actual force. Second, intercourse is accomplished by threat of a great and immediate bodily harm. And so the victim is incapable of consenting due to unconsciousness, intoxication, or mental condition. Or fourth, the victim is fraudulently caused to believe that the act is not intercourse. Please note that consent due to other types of fraud is effective. For example, perpetrator persuading victim that he is a husband or that he will marry her. A statutory rape is a carnal knowledge of female under the age of consent. It is not necessary to show lack of consent. A showing of reasonable mistake as to age or showing of voluntary consent is irrelevant, since statutory rape is a strict liability crime. You can see a C, titled Crime Against Nature. A crime against nature, in other words, sodomy, consists of anal intercourse, oral stimulation of the sexual organs of another, or intercourse with an animal. Adultery is committed by both parties to sexual intercourse if either is validly married to someone else. It is often required that the behavior be open and notorious. Fornication is sexual intercourse or open and notorious cohabitation by unmarried persons. And incest. Incest consists of marriage or sexual act between closely related persons. And seduction consists of inducing by promise of marriage an unmarried woman to engage in intercourse. The Model Penal Code does not require chastity or that the female be unmarried. And lastly, a bigamy. Bigamy is the common law strict liability offense of marrying someone while having another living spouse. And we have several offenses involving a property interest. First, larceny. Larceny consists of taking and carrying away of tangible personal property of another with possession by trespass with intent to permanently deprive the person of interest in the property. And embezzlement is the fraudulent conversion of personal property of another by person in lawful possession of the property. Embezzlement differs from larceny because in embezzlement, the defendant misappropriates property while it is in his right of possession, while in larceny, the defendant misappropriates property not in his possession. Defendant must intend to defraud. If the defendant intends to restore the exact property taken, it is not embezzlement. However, if the defendant intends to restore similar or substantially identical property, it is embezzlement, even if it was money that was initially taken and other money of identical value that he intended to return. As in larceny, embezzlement is not committed if the conversion is pursuant to claim a right to the property. Whether the defendant took the property openly is an important factor. and false pretenses and rivalry. A rivalry consists of a taking of personal property of another from the other's person or presence by force or threats of immediate death or physical injury to the victim, a member of his family, or some person in the victim's presence, with intent to permanently deprive him of. And we can see other property crimes, including extortion, receipt of stolen property, theft, and forgery, and finally, malicious mischief. And we have two typical crimes involving offenses against the habitation, burglary and arson. And there are offenses involving judicial procedure. Finally, let's see, perjury. Perjury is the intentional taking of a false oath in regard to a material matter in a judicial proceeding. And there is a crime called a subordination of perjury. Subordination of perjury consists of procuring or inducing another to commit perjury. And there is a bribery crime. A bribery, a common law, was the corrupt payment or receipt of anything of value for official action. Under modern statutes, it may be extended to non-public officials, and either the offering of a bribe or the taking of a bribe may constitute a crime. And compounding consists of agreeing for variable consideration not to prosecute another for felony or to consider the commission of felony or the whereabouts of felon. Under modern statutes, the definition refers to any crime. A common law misprision of felony consisted of the failure to disclose knowledge of the commission of felony or to prevent the commission of felony. Under modern statutes, a misprision is no longer a crime. Or if it remains a crime, it requires some affirmative action in aid of the fellow. And we now finalize with the vicarious liability and a corporate liability. You can see in the visual rays three presidential hopefuls in South Korea, and here's one of candidates Interestingly, we are now well intoxicated with the word economic democracy, which is so appealing on its face. Actually, newly coined one on unprecedented basis in annual political or economic theory. That is just the statement made a year ago from one of influential businessmen in South Korea. Nonetheless, it is now generally conceived in Korea as one of pivotal virtues to improve the sense of injustice in national economy, and also as one of panacea to cure its current stalemate. Actually, we now are captive of news media, routinely heralding the economic issues and expert opinion about those. That is inevitable. The many interest class of our society to actually suffer from the worst economic condition. The college graduates could hardly find a job. It is one of serious issue for the colleges and universities, and the government raised this point in the evaluation process of financial assistance to them. The economically middle class are often said to be devastated due to a series of economic and financial crises. Therefore, the economic structure of a nation took an odd shape with an extremely small wealthy class as accompanied with a larger poverty class. The words house poor, silver poor, working poor are not just related with the theory or textbook, but is considered to correctly address us and our neighbors. The credit in economic terms long continued to operate as one of a specimen at various scale of society. The crisis on credit started with the U.S. national economy and swept Europe in financial aspect that we long feared of the dismantlement of Eurozone. That would, of course, not be a problem solely affecting Europe itself, but other national economies, including South Korea. Then, we may afraid if the real sector of economy could be seen sound over the decades. We have many economic indicators to assess this trend. The issue of credits likely evoked to spread in other many areas of society. The collapse of small local banks in Korea and recent bankruptcy of Professors Asset Association also in Korea perhaps would be one of unfortunate examples that many Koreans deplore. Then we like to feel the urgency of our neighbors. The economic issue in this respect seems probably to be an employment and job creation. Actually, the agenda attached on job creation has surfaced a paramount concern in the coming elections. The candidate who offers a more persuasive answer to the unemployment problem could now see more a probability to win the election. One other issue would perhaps be how to structure a more reasonable national network on pension plan. Social welfare for more stable economic well-being is also mounting as a critical attraction for many middle-income voters. It is now prevailing to discuss if the current taxation could suffice the large amount of hopeful social welfare system, and how to excise the basic funds to dispense with a large amount of a social program, and a reasonable and practical package of policies to revise the national tax system. As I mentioned, the current debate likely to converge to the word economic democracy. One time, a constitutional student raised the question that he could hardly follow up with the position of one of the key figures who is a prime counselor for President hopeful Kun-hye-pa. He pointed to the counselor's career on the work of constitutional revision about 2 decades ago. As one of constitutional drafters on the section of national economy, Jung Kim, it is his name, introduced a kind of central planning scheme that partially constitutionalized a measure of governmental regulation by providing an exception against principled clause on the market economy, a free enterprise, and capitalism. His question is how he could now assert an economic democracy, betraying his previous position in favor of a controlled economy. As you see, the word democracy is normally narrated to be related with the politics. We can seldom find any authorities on economic democracy. We are generally aware that political democracy contributed to the evolution of capitalistic society, and the constitutional rights to secure the kind of regime currently standing is regarded as fourth generation of constitutional rights. The right to individual liberty, a free speech, right to property, a free contract, and equal rights to vote, or other safeguards from abuse of state power are generally considered to be essential for political democracy. Then you can see second generation of constitutional rights is spreading over many of our social rights, which include the right to labor, the right of labor union, and even the right to strike under a strict precondition, or right to adequate education and social benefits. In contemporary times, the constitutional scholars even frame a kind of third generation constitutional rights, such as the right to moderate housing or the right to live in an undeteriorated environment, or right to family union and the right to socially unite or associate, and the kind. For the nature of original liberalistic constitution, the United States Constitution does not directly provide such kind of arrangement in the document itself, but the context has long evolved at the legislative initiative. Now, let's get back to the inquiry of the student. What does the word democracy work when we refer to it in economic consideration? For the originalist, it might be received as opposite to the controlled economy. But you can easily know both concepts are reinforcing each other, and on its practical operation, both are even the same. There would perhaps be no market-oriented creed at these times, where we are critically interdependent economically, both at national and international scale. It might be the case that pure theorist may hold for his expertise. It is also disclosed to the public in Korea that critical staffs conflict on how to shape the candidate's promise. And we were introduced to the staff's educational and familiar background and his career path. Jong In-kim was known to be educated in Germany and descendant from Ka In-kim, who served as the first Chief Justice of Korea. Under this background, we can make a good guess about his socialistic attitude. The profile of his counterpart, Hangul, seems like to be a proponent of a free market economy. We now think how the concept can operate to get through the dilemma of our national economy. It is now known to be incorrect that a measure of governmental regulation would absolutely hinder the growth of economy. Instead, some commentators advise that the democratization of national economy may contribute to create more jobs. And I like to make one more point that the word economic democracy might in fact be ungrounded in economic theory. Nevertheless, the Article 119 of Korean Constitution expressly employs the word to pronounce the basic scheme of national economy, which should not be understood as a radical one found in communist states. This division on the basic point is not a matter in the current presidential competition. Rather, the economic democracy seems to be shared as a strategic point by all three candidates, but details seem to differ. The behind force to push that motto forward seems to be related with the reforms on chaebol. What do you think about chaebol? Do you perceive it is one of evils? If chaebol is reformed, could it be possible that more jobs are available to the employed persons? Do you agree? If the efficiency caused by chaebol could be cured to procure the funds required to create new jobs? How have you been minded with the political story? Are you politically distanced? You might be more wise to get strenuous on the midterm exam. I suppose that my strolling would also be commonly impressed on your intelligence from various sources of contact. We could soon see the result of outcome in both elections across the Pacific. Korea is not the 54th state of America, but the economic logic seems to come in a fairly similar context. We would soon arrive at final outcome of presidential elections, and the campaign became intensified in its nature of close competition. What I like to point out is that the Korean Constitution authorizes some of regulatory power to restore an economic justice. That is not to be dishonored, rather should offer basis to reach a more persuasive outcome. One other point is that the capital dynamics is critically dependent on the device of cooperation. You take the time to imagine. Most of manufacturing industry are going by the corporate entities. The financial institutions such as bank, stock transaction, insurance company, and other firms are operating their business in the form of legally endorsed corporation. The institutions which rated the credit also take the form of a corporation. This kind of profit organization are actually a main actor to sustain the capitalistic structure of the economy. Of course, the scale of corporate business normally becomes expensive to find a multinational context a usual experience. We may posit if any of criminal polish could effect, but at this point of time, it is largely left outside the criminal scheme of a nation. In some of intelligent area of law, such as Fair Trade Act or laws on security transactions, could do some good in this aspect. At the occasional scene viewed in TV, we can just find a corporate portent to be escorted to the prosecution office for the embezzlement offense. The kind of economic justice could be touched upon in terms of political and economic logic. Of course, the law can work to reform a corporate governance in the context of private law. From this outdated environment, I chose the topic about vicarious liability and corporate criminal liability. A corporate is an independent entity in law, strictly distinguished from its officers and even shareholders. It is a critical instrumentality to bring the success of capitalism. The diffusion of individual responsibility have enabled easier concentration of capitals to exploit the environment for economic prosperity. It is created, continued to operate, and might end through its life as being lawfully insulated from its substantial components. The shareholder's liability is limited to his investment in civil terms, and he or she would, in principle, not be liable for any acts committed in the name of corporation. Only under extreme circumstances, the corporate bail could be stripped, that the civil liability of corporation may be pursued to reach the asset of individual shareholders. Worse though, that might not be true as a matter of law, but only be grounded on the theory of commercial law scholars. The issue of corporate responsibility is, of course, so popularized as one of key areas of controversy in this modern time. That requires an interdisciplinary examination of the problem indeed. The word social is now likely to operate as a great moderator for our maximum level of happiness. And initially, I intended to introduce a typical two cases to show you the rule of a corporate criminal liability, but time has been called. So, in substitute, I like to recommend one article dealing with evolution of corporate accountability. It was authored by Norm Kais and featured in Business of International, September issue 2010. We can have a chance to see the Canadian context of a criminal liability. And the article also gave an insightful instruction about the history of corporate criminal liability and asserted the crisis of moral panic arising from the corporate individual context. The article presented the theme on corporate social responsibility in various contexts. Now in Korea, we talk about the new vision of capitalistic society. We would be aware that at the core of that narrative stood the social responsibility of enterprise. Okay, that will be all for this class. We have spotted several sections of criminal law for consideration. In the next class, we will begin to review the real property law. We'll see you in the next class.